Richard Nixon is not just the only American president to resign. He went to his grave never knowing of the prosecutor's secret allegations that destroyed his presidency. This is Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. I'm Jeff Shepard, and I'm your instructor in a course entitled Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. We start out with a disclaimer. This presentation is week 3 of a 12-week course on the Watergate scandal. It's presented by me during 2019 to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Temple University here in Philadelphia. Today's presentation is focused on the break-in and the cover-up. That's the illegal entry into the offices of the Democratic National Committee and the ensuing and unsuccessful effort to protect the more senior staff from prosecution. I'm also going to cover the break-in trial itself. As before, I'm solely responsible for the content of the course and the viewpoints expressed therein. In short, I'm the insider and these are my views. Now, I know that you know a lot about what happened in public in Watergate, and we're not trying to hide that. We just don't have time to go into that at the same time we're doing the background. So in the first lecture, I told you if you want to see the day-by-day unfolding of this terrible scandal, 2.5 years worth, Congressional Quarterly has the best day-by-day chronology. And if you'd like to know what the prosecutors think about the fine job that they did, they published a report in October of 1975. So we're not hiding that part, we're just not covering it in these lectures. Let's go review the people involved in Watergate. We don't have pictures in the upper left corner of the people caught red-handed, but they were James McCord and 4 Cuban Americans. Down directly below that, the 2 who supervised the break-in but technically weren't inside the DNC were Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. The 2 people who were mainly responsible for the day-to-day running of the cover-up were John Dean and Jeb Magruder. And the 3 who took the biggest fall, the most powerful people caught up in the cover-up scandal, were John Mitchell and Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. And we'll come back to most of these people, but I just want to remind you of who the players are. Last week, we reviewed what I think are the 3 critical time frames for the unfolding of the scandal. What led up to the break-in and what was done right after the break-in, when the cover-up just evolved right out of it. The 2 weeks before the collapse of the cover-up, the pressures that were brought on the system so the cover-up couldn't continue, and the 2 or 3 weeks that culminated in President Nixon's resignation. I think what was going on behind the scenes in those 3 critical time frames are what's most important to understand. And the other thing we did in the first week to try to set the hook and get your interest, we talked about what I think are the 3 most surprising revelations that have come to light since the president resigned. And the first is that the judges were meeting secretly with the prosecutors to work things out in advance of the trial. And secondly, that John Dean, who ran the cover-up, was let go without ever spending a single night in jail. We were told he was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison, but he never went to prison. That was a fraud on the jury and on the American public. And third, what I think is the most surprising revelation is after all said and done, I've concluded that what really destroyed Richard Nixon were allegations that the prosecutors made in secret to the grand jury and to the House Judiciary Committee staff that Richard Nixon had personally approved the payment of blackmail. We didn't know these allegations were made. We had no opportunity to disprove them. But if you knew as much as I know, I think you would agree that's what destroyed his presidency. Now we'll go on to today. We're going to talk about the events that culminated in the break-in. What was it that led these people to go into the DNC at night and get arrested on June 17th? Well, John Dean says in his talk with the president on March 21st that this all started when I was assigned the responsibility for developing a perfectly legitimate campaign intelligence plan. Now, every campaign has an intelligence plan. Then, now, before, you want to know what the opposition is doing. Where are they speaking? What is their point of view? When do they want rallies? And you want to learn as much as you can about the other side. We went a little further and caused real troubles. But the idea of having someone go responsible for knowing what the other side is doing is part and parcel of our electoral system. The first idea on that was a plan called Sandwedge. It's number 2 here, that Jack Caulfield was going to put together. Jack was a retired detective who worked in the counsel's office. And he developed this plan, which was going to be an independent entity which would gather the campaign intelligence. Think GPS Fusion, just to pick a name. But they didn't think Jack was up to the task, so they said, no, we'll go another way. So John Dean recruited and hired Gordon Liddy. Now, Gordon Liddy was on the domestic council staff, and he had just completed the ill-fated break-in into Dan Ellsberg's shrink's office. And when the superiors at the White House learned of the break-in, what was supposed to be a surreptitious black bag job, but there was a break-in, they said, no more. We're stopping this. Liddy had nothing to do. So when John Dean was looking for someone to handle campaign intelligence, there was Liddy, and Liddy was available. So he hires him. He takes him over to John Mitchell, who's still Attorney General. He introduces him as his choice, and he shows up at the committee to re-elect the president, and he says to Jeb Magruder, who's the acting director, this is our choice. Gordon Liddy is going to do a campaign intelligence plan, and while he's here, he's going to be counsel to the committee and worry about election law and other stuff. But the most important thing is the plan. Well, Liddy starts talking about the fact he's been promised $1 million. And I think I mentioned this before. Jeb Magruder, who's just warming the seat, he says, well, the only person who can approve $1 million expenditure is John Mitchell. He's over at the AG's office. So they troop over to go see John Mitchell. And the first meeting is January 27th, 1971. And it's Gordon Liddy, who's developed the plan, Jeb Magruder, who's his boss at CREEP, John Mitchell, who's in the office, and John Dean, because John's in charge of campaign intelligence. And Liddy presents this crazy plan with charts prepared by the CIA, mugging, bugging, kidnapping, prostitution. We talked about it before. And Mitchell says, that's not quite what we had in mind. So they go back in the car, one car, all 3 guys. John stays in his office. And Liddy is complaining nobody backed him up on his great plan. And the advice in the car is, you'll want to destroy those charts, Gordon. Why don't you come back with something a little less grandiose? Well, he does. And Mitchell doesn't even want to see him. He won't set up the meeting. So Jeb goes to John Dean and says, you got to help us. We got to go back. And they set it up for February 4th. And now it's a $500,000 plan. And mugging, kidnapping, and prostitution are gone. But bugging is still in. And they have targets for who they want to bug. John Dean shows up a little bit late. We aren't sure how late. Opinions differ. And he says, we shouldn't even be discussing this in front of the Attorney General. Now, he's trying to tell us later that he was trying to shut it off. But that's not true. What he meant was, John shouldn't know about this. You come to me with these ideas, because John's got to be able to disown it if something goes wrong. And that's called, in campaign parlance and in other things, plausible deniability. You don't tell everybody because they don't need to know stuff. You think you're doing what they would want you to do, but there's no paper trail. There's no meeting. Meeting breaks up. Gordon's upset because his $500,000 plan hasn't been approved. Now, John Dean says he then went back to the White House and told Bob Haldeman, there's some crazy ideas going on at the committee to reelect. I don't think the White House should be a part of it. And when he first started pushing this idea, Haldeman said, I don't remember this, but I can't say it didn't happen. I just don't have any memory. And John figures, well, if there's no pushback, I can kind of expand my claim. And it evolves from, I told Bob we shouldn't be involved, to Bob was supposed to shut it off. And the prosecutors who have glommed onto John Dean as their path to Haldeman and Ehrlichman, they say, wow, this is when John dropped out of the conspiracy because he told Bob to shut it off and then he wasn't involved any further. Bob said at the end, in his last statements, that upon reflection in light of everything that went on, that there's no record of John meeting with Bob, there's no notation in his schedule, and they were very precise about who was seeing the chief of staff. His top assistant, Larry Higbee, has no memory. John said, well, Higbee snuck me in. Higbee has no memory of this occurring. There's no notation in the diary. And Bob concluded at the end it never happened. It was just an invention by John Dean. But that's the way this thing is evolving. Okay. Liddy, I'm down to number 5. Liddy is sure this is going to be approved at some point. So he's ordered a bunch of stuff from the spy shops. Walkie-talkies, disguises, telephone bugging equipment, and he's committed to stuff, but he doesn't have any money. And if you remember, I told you earlier that he had threatened to kill Jeb Magruder, and it was a serious threat. I mean, Gordon is a really militant, tough guy. Let me tell you how tough I am. Yeah, have you heard the candle trick? Well, they're out reconnoitering the break-in out in Dr. Fielding's office, and they're in a bar, and he and Howard Hunt are trying to recruit a secretary, a waitress, to come help them do this stuff. And she says, look, if you get caught, you'll flip on me. You know, why would I do this? And Gordon says, let me show you how tough I am. And he puts his hand over the candle until his flesh catches on fire. He says, that's how tough I am. Okay? This is called the candle trick. Now, this is Gordon. Okay? You sleep at night. You think life is good. I'm in the White House when Gordon comes back to work the next day and his hand's all bandaged up. Hey, Gordon, what happened to your hand? Oh, it's a funny thing. I was lighting my pipe and I was tamping it with a book of matches and I was looking at a pretty girl and the matches caught on fire, burned my hand. Isn't that stupid? You know, that was his excuse. And then later you learn about the candle trick. Same thing happened. My secretary had a birthday. We were celebrating her birthday. He got to bragging about this and he put his hand over his forearm over the candle. And the party breaks up to the smell of burning flesh. I mean, you know, the guy, how could you have this guy around? So he's made these financial commitments. He's ordered this equipment, and he's all over Jeb Magruder. Where's my money? Where's my money? Where's my money? So Jeb gives him $37,000. And he gives it to him earlier in March. What is important is he gives it to him before the plan is approved. Okay? $37,000, no question about that. Then Magruder goes to Miami to meet with John Mitchell. John resigned as Attorney General. He comes on as head of CREEP on March 1st. This is a meeting on March 30th. Jeb flies down to review a bunch of stuff that Mitchell has to make decisions on, and there are 19 items on the list. We have the list. The last one is Liddy's campaign intelligence plan, now priced at $250,000. You know, we went from $1 million to $500,000 to $250,000. There are 3 people in the room: John Mitchell, Jeb Magruder, and a Mitchell aide named Fred LaRue. And we'll come back to LaRue a couple times. And Mitchell and LaRue swear that when this came up, Mitchell said, "Not this again. I don't want to see this anymore." And Magruder says, "Oh, no. LaRue must have stepped out of the room because Mitchell said, 'Sure, let's give him $250 and see what he can do.'" So, and you need to know it, at a certain point, LaRue pleads to a single plea and turns state's evidence. So he's in theory got no more reason to lie, but he never turned on Mitchell. So you got 2-1. It's okay. Jeb comes out from the meeting and acts as though Mitchell approved it. And I told you, Mitchell spends half his time at trial saying, "I had nothing to cover up. I never approved the plan in the first place." 7 times, Magruder tells other people the plan's been approved, but he never uses Mitchell's name. Plan's got the blessing of the head shed. The big enchilada has approved. We're all go. Never once can they find him telling anybody John Mitchell's approved the plan. We just don't know. Gets back to Washington. Liddy puts in for $80,000. The campaign treasurer says, "You got to be kidding." Hugh Sloan, neat guy. Hugh goes to Maury Stans, who's head of finance, says they want $80,000. Not on Liddy's word. Well, Magruder said he should do it. So Stans, who's former cabinet secretary for commerce and big, important, heavy guy, he's head of finance for the re-election committee. He calls up Mitchell and he says, "There's this $80,000 withdrawal, that Magruder has authorized. What do you think?" And Mitchell says, "Magruder's the one dealing with the budget." Okay? Doesn't say, "I know what it's for," anything else, just says Magruder's the guy who deals with that. So they give Liddy the money. Liddy goes, buys all the stuff. I'm going to stop there for a second because when I tell you I just don't know if Mitchell's guilty or not, that's why. You know everything I know about before the break-in. So Liddy hires his team and there's a break-in. And the first break-in is successful. They go in on May 28th, and they plant a bug on Larry O'Brien's phone, and they plant a bug on Spencer Oliver's secretary's desk, Maxine Wells. And they photocopy some stuff, and they get out. And then across the street at the Howard Johnsons, they have a listening booth because the bugs will only transfer so far. And they got to have line of sight for this to work. Larry O'Brien's office is on the back, so it doesn't work. But Maxine Wells' phone tap works. And this guy named Alfred Baldwin is sitting listening to the tap. But it really gets odd because they're not recording what they're picking up. If Baldwin goes to the bathroom or walks across to the DNC to talk to a secretary he likes, or goes home at night, they don't pick it up. So there's no record except Baldwin's handwritten notes of what's going on. And it's not particularly good, but Magruder is thrilled because we got a tap going. So he's eager to share this with other people. Now, he's not supposed to, but he's giddy with power. And if you were to go over, I physically never set foot in the re-election committee, but if you were to go over and call on your friend Jeb, he'd say, "I got this secret I really can't tell you, but let me tell you what's going on." And when the thing all fell through, the prosecutors were bound and determined to find every person Jeb talked to. So there were a lot of people who just happened to go into Jeb's office whose lives were shredded because Jeb may or may not have told them a little bit about the campaign intelligence. Jeb couldn't remember who he told and who he didn't tell. So it was, kind of this half of the room is in trouble and this half isn't. You don't know where it's going to go. So then Jeb says to Liddy, you got to go back in. I want to know what Larry O'Brien knows, and that tap doesn't work. And they go back in and they get caught. Now, Hunt didn't want to go back in. He said, this is high risk, low reward. Larry O'Brien's already gone down to Miami for the convention. We're not going to find anything there. But Magruder was insistent. So they went in and they got caught. Okay? Now, last time we talked about what they did right after they got caught. They put out a press release saying, not us. They met in Mitchell's apartment. They divvied stuff up. They knew, I mean, Liddy knew, and because they were his people, and John Dean knew, because Liddy told him. And then Dean says, oh, I can handle this. You know, I'm the lawyer. It's my job. And so he becomes the lead on trying to contain the problem at Creek. Now, contain is huge. It's a term, but it's hugely ambiguous. When he would say, I'm having trouble containing it, or this is a real effort, they didn't realize that he was committing criminal acts. They thought he was making sure it stayed kitty-cornered physically across the street where the committee to re-elect was. But, and I told you this last time, Mitchell out of the blue resigns. So that's the immediate aftermath. And it goes to July 1st. Well, what happened from the Department of Justice? Well, they appoint 3 guys to conduct the investigation. Earl Silbert's lead, and he's principal assistant United States Attorney, and he has 2 helpers, Seymour Glanzer and Doug Campbell. And we're going to go forward and then come back to this, but there's a 3-month investigation that culminates in the indictments on September 15th. But let's go forward and learn just a little bit more about Earl. Earl is one of my heroes, perhaps the only genuine hero in all of Watergate. He's a prosecutor's prosecutor. Naturally, he went to Harvard College, Harvard Law School. And then he got into the honors program at the Department of Justice, and he stays for almost 20 years. Okay? And he does a whole bunch of assignments in Main Justice, including working with John Dean on what became the D.C. crime bill. And then he's appointed principal assistant U.S. attorney in 1972, stays for 2 years through Watergate, and then he becomes U.S. attorney. So even though he's involved, his reputation was such that he's named the United States attorney. Neat guy. He's the lead prosecutor. He's responsible for breaking the cover-up. They'll tell you it's Woodward and Bernstein or the McCord letter. That's not true. It's Earl Silbert. And I will tell you why in just a moment. Let me be sure. He writes I skipped. I have something else. Let me go back. Okay. Silbert, after a 3-month investigation, writes a memo to Henry Peterson, and the memo's dated September 13th. This is 2 days before the announcement of the indictments. And I was going through my files, and I got the copy with me. Okay, so there's a 21-page memo to Henry Peterson where Earl says, this is what we found. 3 months of investigation, 100 FBI agents, all kinds of uses of the grand jury. And he says, we're going to indict and convict the people we can prove were involved. Then we'll see if their stories change after they get convicted. We're not saying there's nobody else. We're just saying we don't have proof. And I'm going to read you his last paragraph, because this is key. This is typical Earl Silbert. Immunity still remains a potentially useful tool in this case. As mentioned above, despite the exhaustive investigation, there's no evidence incriminating anyone other than the 7 persons we propose to indict. It's possible and perhaps even likely no one else was involved. In any event, in our view, there are 2 ways, somewhat related, to try to find out. First, after indictment and trial, if convicted, Hunt and Liddy may talk. Or, after trial, if convicted, Hunt and Liddy could then be granted immunity and required to testify. These may be the only paths available to determine if anyone else was involved in the Watergate break-in. So it's not a cover-up that involves Earl Silbert. It's Silbert saying, this is how prosecutors work. You convict who you can, and then you see what's going to happen. Okay? So they indicted them on the 15th, 7 people. Hunt, Liddy, McCord, and the Cubans. Well, here sits Senator Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, on Senate Judiciary Committee on September 15th, and he doesn't like the fact it doesn't go up further. So he decides to launch his own investigation. I told you there were 5 investigations. The second one is launched by Senator Kennedy. He's chairman of a subcommittee, the Administrative Practices Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he assigns 5 of his 6 staff people to go investigate Watergate. And what he stumbles onto is this guy named Donald Segretti. Segretti was the dirty trickster. And Segretti was bouncing around the nation, helping to mess up the other side. I remember I told you I call it black advance. You know, you go see if you can, if you know they're going to speak in Toulouse, you go try to get the students to come out with pickets and protest when the candidate comes. If you know they're working late and they got a big thing the next day, you order 100 pizzas, and then when the pizzas come, nobody can pay for the pizzas. So what Senator Kennedy did was issue administrative subpoenas. There's 2 levels of subpoenas. This is just his authority as chairman of the Subcommittee on Administrative Practices to the telephone company and to the credit card company. And privacy wasn't as emphasized then as it is today. So they gave him all of Segretti's records, and they could trace where Segretti had gone. And then as that developed, Mike Mansfield, who is the majority leader of the Senate, Democrat from Montana, he says, this is getting too political. We can't have Kennedy, who may run for president against Nixon, leading the investigation. So let's change the investigation. And that's where the Irvin Committee comes from. But what's important to understand is they just took Kennedy's people and assigned them. And the one in particular who's the most fun is this gentleman named Carmine Bellino, who has a really interesting background. He was J. Edgar Hoover's top assistant years before. And then he becomes Joe Kennedy's private secretary. And then he handles problems for the Kennedy family. And he's naturally, under Ted Kennedy, he's lead investigator. And then he becomes the Irvin Committee's lead investigator because they know who they're after. So we're going to advance the slides, and we're reminding you what John Dean was doing while Earl Silbert's run on the investigation. John's doing his dead level best to thwart it. He's coordinating all the interviews. He's opposing any White House disclosures. I mean, what was the original break-in? Someone asked me earlier, if Nixon had come clean, would he have been driven from office? And I said, well, no, he didn't know anything about it. Haldeman Ehrlichman didn't know anything about it. It's never been shown they knew about the break-in in advance. But they didn't know there was a cover-up going on. So it wasn't who they could disclose, my view. Okay, and I mentioned to you that John not only was running the cover-up, but he committed 4 additional crimes in addition to obstruction of justice. He rehearsed Jeb Magruder for his perjured testimony. They have a meeting about what to do. Jeb's got this diary, and it shows these 2 meetings at the Department of Justice. And John Dean's first idea is, could you erase my name so I'm not there? And they say, well, the FBI will figure it out. They can tell, it's been erased. So the story they concoct is the first meeting, January 27th, was postponed. And that's the second meeting, and the second meeting was to discuss state election laws. And that's what Jeb liked. That's what he lied to in front of the grand jury. And Dean is rehearsing him on this. He destroyed evidence taken out of Hunt's safe. Hunt had this, what's called the Hermes notebook. and he was writing down everything that he was doing. And after he's convicted, dragged back before the grand jury, he keeps telling the grand jurors that I had a diary. The diary was in my safe. You find that diary, it will show you everything I did under instruction from the other people. Can't find the diary. So one of the prosecutors is over talking to Dean, saying, Hunt's saying there's a diary. And, oh, that diary. Well, when we undid his safe and we looked at the stuff, I didn't think it was relevant, so I put that in my file cabinet. And then a month or two later, I just threw it out. Oh, really? Nothing, no problem at all, because that would have nailed John Dean. And the prosecutors have already got him as their lead conduit to the higher ups, so they do nothing about this. He made unauthorized disclosures of prosecutorial information, and as I told you, he's the only one who took money. He had $20,000 of campaign funds in his office safe. He withdrew $4,000 for his honeymoon. Now, he says, I put a check in my safe at the same time, so I didn't take the money. He didn't go on the honeymoon. He didn't replace the money. He didn't have $4,000 in the bank to cover the check anyway. And after all this went on, after he'd gone to the prosecutors, his lawyer comes down and says, we need to mention that John nibbled at some money, no big thing. They can't even account for the other $16,000. They don't know where it went as Watergate blew up. But John's the only one who took money. So we go to the evolving cover-up. What John Dean was trying to do was to coordinate and monitor the FBI interviews of the White House staff. That's not odd. You don't just come ripping through the White House staff. They had a lawyer sit in on the interviews. Then they decided they would raise and provide funds to the break-in defendants. Liddy, when he goes with Dean on this walk in the park, he says, my people are stand-up people, but you got to take care of them. You got to pay their legal bills. And they paid a total of $425,000 of legal bills and humanitarian aid, quotes, humanitarian aid, because the guys were in jail and their families were hungry. Nothing pleases prosecutors more than you being isolated from your friends, accused of doing something criminal, and having no money. And your employer says, well, shoot, that's not fair. So they spring for your lawyers, okay? This was known. They had meetings. They were going to call it Fair Play for Cubans, where they were going to run the money. But that's not how it evolved. The guys running the cover-up were paying them off in secret. Herb Kalmbach was the president's private lawyer out in Newport Beach. He'd call up major campaign donors and say, we need some money, can't tell you why, cough up some money. And Fred LaRue, who was a Mitchell guy at the campaign, he was the paymaster. He had the money. And he would dispense it through this guy named Anthony Ulasewicz. You may remember Tony. He was kind of the buffoon in the Irvin hearings. He's a New York City cop. And he would pay but secret drops in phone booths and other clearly surreptitious payments, which made the money so significant in the trial. The prosecutors ceded at the beginning of trial that every dime was paid for legal expenses or humanitarian aid. They conceded that. But they also said, but if one red cent was also meant to buy silence, then that's obstruction of justice. And here's John Dean, who's switched and he's on the government side, so well, of course it was to buy silence. So if you really look at the cover-up trial itself, it turns on this payment of money. And the top people are saying, we didn't know how the payments were being made. We were told it was for legal fees and humanitarian aid. Jury didn't believe him. Mrs. Hunt, Howard Hunt's wife, distributed the money to the Cubans. Because you remember, Howard Hunt is the famous Eduardo who helped recruit Cubans for the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. And they trust him. He's the one that got them involved. So his wife was funneling the money to the Cubans. Howard was in jail. And his lawyer, Bill Bittman, and we'll come back to Bittman a couple of times, he was paying the other lawyers their legal fees. So they were the two conduits for the money. There was also a civil suit filed by the DNC the moment after the break-in. This suit appears out of nowhere. I'm told it's a 300-page complaint that shows up 2 days after the break-in. The DNC is suing the RNC or the committee to re-elect for being responsible for the break-in. And what's intriguing is that Alfred Baldwin, the former FBI agent who's listening on this stuff, leaves, runs away, goes upstate somewhere into New England, hires a lawyer, and the lawyer turns out to be an ardent Democrat, and so the lawyer arranges to ask questions of Baldwin, which are relayed in real time to Joe Califano, who's one of Ed Williams' law partners. The law firm is Williams, Connolly, and Califano. So this civil suit takes on huge significance because they've got full background on what was going on that the White House didn't really know about. But and Baldwin says, I never talked to the other side. And they say, well, what about these interviews? Oh, I didn't know who I was talking to. I was just shooting the breeze with somebody, and my lawyer was helping me to work on my story. So John Dean decides what we need. We need to know where the investigation is going and what they know. And he goes to Henry Peterson. Now, Silber's boss at Justice, the head of the criminal division, is Henry Peterson. Hugely respected, worked for 12 attorneys general. Lots of prosecutors cut their teeth under Henry Peterson. Dean says, the president's asked me to be kept in the loop on how the investigation's going. And Peterson says, pound sand. And then he goes to Kleindienst, who's attorney general, and he says, the president wants to know what's going on. And Kleindienst said, if there's something the president needs to know, I'll tell him. Don't worry about it. But he goes to Pat Gray, who's acting director of the FBI, and good old Pat, oh, sure. We'll tell you right where we are. So Dean gets these reports that he shares with defense counsel, which is, of course, obstruction of justice. And then we talked about the word contain and the doctrine of plausible deniability. You can prove that Dean met during the course of the cover-up with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. The meetings occurred. If you're outside the Oval Office, there's no tape recording. So what I think happened, Pollyanna Jeff, is he would say, well, I'm having trouble containing the problem. But he didn't say, by the way, I'm rehearsing Jeb Magruder to perjure testimony, or we're paying off these guys behind the barn, so they stay quiet, or I found it convenient to destroy some evidence from Howard Hunt's safe. I don't think they ever knew that. They would have stopped it. But Dean could say, I was doing what I thought they would want me to do, but I didn't tell them because of plausible deniability. But the end goal as the cover-up evolves and we get closer to trial, if the guys plead guilty, there's no trial. So the effort was, through the lawyers, get your client to plead guilty. We go to the next slide. And we interrupt this discussion to talk about your favorite guy, Deep Throat. Woodward and Bernstein are publishing these articles. They keep the scandal alive. Everybody says, oh, they broke the scandal. Earl Silbert says not one fact revealed by Woodward and Bernstein helped in the investigation. They were reporting what the government already knew and was investigating because the FBI, Mark Felt, was spilling the beans of where the government was. The public didn't know this. But this is somebody on the trip telling you where they are, and the people already know where they are. because the prosecutors were running the investigation. But Woodward and Bernstein get the credit. Now, they published a book and a movie. How many people read the book? How many people saw the movie? They're different. The story that I like is that Robert Redford approaches Woodward and says, I want to do a movie about you guys, not about Watergate, about your effort. So don't wait till this is over. Let's go do it now. But first, we'll publish a book which will build suspense for the movie. And when they put in the draft of the book, which is about them, really not about the case, the editor said that we need some more pizzazz. And that's where they came up with the name Deep Throat. The Deep Throat wasn't used during their reporting. It's added because the editor says, I need a hook, I need a better story. So out comes Deep Throat. For 3 decades, anytime you went to a cocktail party that involved Washingtonians, who's Deep Throat? Do you know who Deep Throat is? Well, who could it be? And it was always somebody on the White House staff. It was Pat Buchanan, Mrs. Nixon, Diane Sawyer, John Rose, John Dean, Fred Fielding, all my friends. And why is that the focus was always on the White House staff? It's because the movie is different from the book. After Mark Felt came out and said it was me, I went back and read the book, and they're perfectly straight in the book. There's no indication whatsoever that Deep Throat works at the White House. Well, they happen to know he didn't. But when they made the movie, 3 different times, there's the clear implication that Deep Throat works at the White House. If you remember, I remember, because I went back and watched it, they're hanging out in front of the Library of Congress, and they've run into a dead end. They're out of leads. And Redford says, I know somebody at the White House. Maybe they'd help. And then in a separate scene, Redford calls Deep Throat at work. And Deep Throat says, never call me at work. And he's in a phone booth that's across the street from the old executive office building. And he's looking, and there really isn't a phone booth there, but there is for the movie. He's looking up at the old EOB while he's talking to Deep Throat. Clear implication, that's where Deep Throat works. And then the third thing, at one point they're going to go meet, and Hal Holbrook is pulling out at night. And there's a shot up, from the floorboards looking at Holbrook as he exits. And he's exiting from the northwest gate. Okay? But Mark Felt was never coming out of the northwest gate with paperwork. So the implication that it was the White House, some individual who was so disgusted with Nixon and the cover-up and everything else, they were spilling the beans to Woodward and Bernstein, is a fiction. It's a fiction because Hollywood likes fictions. Then it turns out Deep Throat comes out as Mark Felt in 2005. He's senile. It's his daughter who outs him, looking to get paid on an article. Mark Felt can't confirm or deny because his mind left a long, long time ago. And Woodward rushes out a book called The Invisible Man and says, I kept the secret, but it's all Felt. Maybe so, maybe not. We don't know. That's just one of those things we don't know. In 2012, Max Holland, who's a good author, writes a book, Leak, Why Mark Felt Became Deep Throat. And he says, he wasn't trying to bring Nixon down. He was trying to show that Pat Gray couldn't handle the FBI, and Mark, who was deputy, wanted to be appointed because Gray wasn't going to make it. And that's why he was leaking stuff. We're left with 3 unanswered questions. Is Deep Throat a composite? Not one guy, but is it, that's the name they use for all their sources. I happen to think that's true. We have people who've devoted their lives to making a computer program of every single word in the Woodward and Bernstein's book to try to figure out who Deep Throat might have been. He moves the flower pot on the back porch. Well, to reach the flower pot, the guy had to be 6'1". So let's eliminate everybody who's shorter. And they try to document as though the book were so computer precise you could get it, but you can't. They're telling a good story, and they're making stuff up to tell a good story. There's another author we'll come to in a minute, Len Klodny, who is just positive that Woodward is a military intelligence officer and was involved in connection with spying on the White House and the shenanigans that were going on. I don't know. But it is, he has a strange background. He appears at the Washington Post almost out of nowhere, and he gets the biggest story. And then I think I told you, there's this revelation that they actually did interview Watergate grand jurors, which is a huge no-no, and that they lied about it for decades. And I use the term Woodstein. That's how those of us that are inside refer to Woodward and Bernstein, so we can say the word easier. But their book, this Secretariat Creep, they say is W, really was a grand juror that they interviewed, and they lied about having interviewed them. So I was there. Occasionally make a mistake and tell people I was there. And people would say, well, if you were on the White House staff, do you know who Deep Throat is? And I would say, yes, it's Mark Felt. And they'd never heard the name. And they would say, Mark Felt. And I said, yeah, the White Rat. And, the White Rat? I said, yeah. That's on the tapes. There's this cute segment of the tapes where Al Haig is sitting there talking to Nixon, and he says, we think the leaks are coming from this guy at the FBI, Mark Felt, the White Rat. And Nixon says, well, what is this? He says, that's the nickname they call Felt behind his back over at the FBI. And Nixon says, the White Rat? And Haig says, this is on the tape. Yeah, he has a long, sallow face, you know, and he's kind of thin, and, well, Mr. President, he looks like a rat. They're fun stuff on the tape sometimes. Okay, we go to the judge. Here come the judge, John Cerrika. Really interesting background. He's chief judge of the District of Columbia trial courts, federal trial courts, but by seniority, not because they elected him. He was a semi-pro boxer, and he dropped out of law school twice before graduating from Georgetown. In that era, you didn't have to go to college to go to law school. So he's never spent a single day in college. Started out at George Washington Law School, dropped out because he couldn't understand. This is from his autobiography. Went to Georgetown, dropped out of Georgetown because he couldn't understand what they were talking about. Graduates from Georgetown. Wasn't even going to take the bar exam because he never really understood what they were talking about. So without any prep course, without anything else, he just sits down, takes the bar, and then goes down to Miami to have another fight. He passed the bar. He became an assistant U.S. attorney during Prohibition from 30 to 34. And then he enters into what he calls his starvation period. He went into private practice. He didn't have any clients. 15 years of living hand to mouth. And then he becomes a partner at Hogan and Hartson. Hogan and Hartson is a Catholic law firm. Everybody went to Georgetown. And it handles local problems in Washington. It's not the prestige firm like Covington and Burling that handles the big government stuff. They represent the trolley company and the fire department and that sort of thing. And Edward Bennett Williams is going to leave Hogan and start his own trial firm. And he says to the folks at Hogan, you ought to hire Cerrika to take my place. And they do. And he stays for 8 years. And it's just not working out. I mean, Cerrika's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. So they place him on the federal bench. Now, they'll make a big thing out of this. Cerrika was appointed by Eisenhower. And that's true. But when you dig in the back of the story, there's no senators from the District of Columbia. Every place else, every other state, you work out a deal with the two senators on who you're going to appoint to the federal bench because they got to confirm. There's trouble going on right now about that, but you normally work it out. Well, there was nobody to work it out with for the district. District's so Democrat it doesn't matter. And this law firm, which is a reasonable law firm, says, help us out. Hey, we got to get rid of this guy. So he goes on the bench. Okay? He earns this reputation as Maximum John because he sentences people to the maximum criminals, to the maximum sentence that can be handed down. We loved him when he was sentencing drug dealers. We thought that was really cool. He was also the most reverse judge in the whole D.C. district because he didn't respect defendants' rights. And so he kept getting reversed by a very, very liberal circuit court. He appointed himself to be the trial judge for both the break-in and the cover-up cases. And he was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year for his presiding over the break-in trial. He was close friends with Edward Ben Williams. Edward Ben Williams is his career mentor. And with Clark Molinoff, we'll get to Clark in a few minutes. He got to know Clark when they were investigating union corruption. Cerrika says in his book, I was invited to the White House to have lunch with Clark. It was the only time I've ever eaten at the White House. And he was really good friends with Sam Dash, who's the chief counsel of the Irvin Committee, because they're professors at Georgetown. So Dash is down talking to him all the time. And we've discovered that he had all these ex parte meetings with the prosecutors and with outsiders who had a point of view. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer to suspect maybe that's not the way the system's supposed to work. But we have documented proof. It's like John had an open door policy. You know, if you got a point of view, drop by. I'd love to talk to you about it. That's my boy. Okay, the break-in trial. The break-in trial occurs January 8th to January 30th. They're indicted in September. It should have occurred earlier. But Cerrika threw out his back and was not willing to let go of the trial, so it's postponed till after the election. Now put this in your mind. This is January of 73. Nixon is being re-inaugurated. Greatest electoral sweep in the nation's history, and this break-in trial is going on. Cerrika turns it into a search for the truth. He's not worried about the guilt or innocence. I mean, 5 of the guys are caught red-handed. He wants to know how they got there. And he starts cross-examining these people in front of the jury. Remember I told you the goal of the cover-up was get these people to plead. There won't be a trial. Hunt pleads guilty on the first day of trial. Now, he was indicted on 6 counts. He works out a plea deal with the prosecutors where he's going to plead to 3. Cerrika says, no way. I want to see the trial. So either you plead to all 6 counts, and I'm going to sentence you to the maximum on each count, or you stand trial. And Hunt takes a deep breath. His wife has died in the plane crash. His daughter's disabled daughter. His life is ruined. He says, okay, 6 counts. 3 days later, the Cubans do the same thing. I mean, the cover-up is putting real pressure through the lawyers, get these people to plead guilty. And the same deal, the Cubans have to plead guilty to everything. They take a deep breath, they plead. Liddy is talking to no one, and McCord is really strange. McCord is a retired CIA, career CIA wireman. And stories differ on whether he did all the wiretaps himself or whether he supervised an electronics division that was really good at wiretaps. He had a really interesting approach, defense at trial. Neither took the stand. There was an old wives' tale that the government would sooner let a defendant go than reveal some super secret intelligence stuff. So McCord knows there's a tap on the Chilean embassy in Washington, and the government doesn't want anybody to know. So he calls the embassy. Hi, this is James McCord. I thought I'd check on the weather today. And then he says, his lawyer says, we want to know any overhears that the government has on James McCord. You know. And he knows, because this was scuttlebutt at the CIA, they'll never reveal the existence of the tap, so they'll dismiss the charge before they'll reveal that. Well, they said, no, there are no overhears. He said, well, that can't be. So he calls again. I don't know, it's James McCord. And apparently the CIA wasn't talking to the prosecutors. Prosecutors didn't have any idea who to ask. So James gets convicted and Gordon Liddy gets convicted. And Cerrika announces when they're convicted how disappointed he is that he didn't discover the truth. He calls for a Senate investigation. He expresses great disappointment in what was going on, and he gives the prosecutors a list of 8 names, and he demands they be called in front of the grand jury. Now, we don't know who's on the list, but we know one of those names was subsequently indicted in the cover-up. But here John, supposedly a judge, is involving himself in such a way that he's not really acting as a judge. So then I come to later revelations, and I have with me Renata Adler's book, Canaries in the Mine Shaft. Renata is one of my favorite people, very, very liberal, very liberal. And she writes a book about the last days of the New Yorker. She's heavily involved in publication and opinions and all that sort of stuff. And she puts a phrase in this book about the New Yorker. I will read you the phrase. Contrary to his reputation as a hero, Cerrika was in fact a corrupt, incompetent, and dishonest figure with a close connection to Senator Joseph McCarthy and clear ties to organized crime. Now, she was explaining why, when she was editor of the New Yorker, she declined to review Cerrika's book. And she puts this sentence in, well, Cerrika's son, Jack Cerrika, works for Newsday in a Long Island publication. They go crazy. The New York Times says you cannot disparage one of the great heroes in American jurisprudence. And they dump all over her. There's 7 days of articles ripping Renata apart for having said this. So she waits, and then she publishes, and it's the last essay in this book, Canaries in the Mine Shaft, and she just takes Cerrika apart. I mean, I can't read the whole chapter. It is so good. She says, you read his biography and you know there's things that are just wrong here. His dad was a close friend. The way she ends is his dad is a barber and he's close friends with Al Capone's dad, who's a barber, that his dad was bouncing around the East Coast and he kept having to move on. And his dad ran in Washington a barber shop, Empire Barber Shop, with 14 chairs, and they were dispensing hooch out of the barber shop. You know, it's one of the great speakeasies. And she just goes on and on and on. And she says there's one part where she says he was secretly indicted for fixing a boxing match because he was a semi-pro boxer. And boxing was illegal in Washington, D.C. throughout Cerrika's time as a boxer. And so when he says he was promoting fights, he had to be involved with organized crime because they had to handle the money, they had to pay off the police, they had to do all this kind of stuff. And she just rips him apart. And then she ends, and I'll read you one paragraph, because she doesn't like him as a judge. And she talks about all the stuff he did wrong in the Watergate trial, in the break-in trial. A judge, after all, is not meant to be a hero. Judges under the Constitution are not meant to ascertain, least of all to prosecute or coerce by sentencing, the truth for the American people or even for the jury. They are to preside fairly under the adversary system over cases presented by lawyers for the plaintiffs and the defendants before them. Anything else, whether it's posturing for the media, coercing defendants with outrageous provisional sentences, or working on behalf of some party not before the court, undermines the system. Far from demonstrating that no man is above the law, it suggests the judge himself is above it. We do not, under the Constitution, have a system wherein judges are the inquisitors. It's kind of neat. And of course, she's taking on one of the great heroes of Watergate, not my hero. So we go on. There's a series of books that say, you know, this burglary just doesn't make any sense. all the stories we're told, they can't be true. And I call them the doubter books. And there's a series of books, and they all have different theories. But the first one is published by Fred Thompson. You know Fred Thompson because he was a senator from Tennessee and a famous actor. But he was, before he was famous, he was minority counsel to the Irvin Committee. I think when we do the Irvin Committee, we'll have Fred in the slide. And after the committee's over, he writes this book at that point in time. And he describes what they were doing on the minority side, where they lost. And at the end, the last chapter is called Unanswered Questions. And he lists all this stuff that they could have found out if they just had more time. And they didn't. So he ends up, let me get to the end of it here. Did McCord, for whatever reason, deliberately leave the tape on the door? Did someone alert Schofler? He's the police officer who shows up unannounced. Did Baldwin give away the plan inadvertently? Did information pass from Sturgis to Anderson to Haddad to the DNC? Or had the officers of the November group been bugged? This guy in New York sends a letter to the DNC and says, you know, they're coming for you. There's going to be a break-in to your headquarters, and it's going to be done by Cubans. And they send a guy up to New York to interview him, and you could conclude that they knew we were coming. Doesn't make it right, but they knew we were coming. So, and he goes through all this stuff they might have been able to show if they had the resources or had the time or could find the interest. And then he ends, it's the end of the chapter, because nearly all of our information stemmed from testimony taken under oath. His staff prepared an elaborate, thoroughly documented report on their investigation. We drew no conclusions. We made no conclusions, but all the facts are there. We made one major effort to include it in the Watergate Committee's final report. As we had expected, however, Senator Irvin, accepted the majority staff's opinion the report was too speculative, so it was never published. Well, the Irvin Committee sealed its records for 50 years. So what you have is a trail of investigations that didn't quite reach fruition. But we can't even follow the trail because it's under lock and key. That's Fred's story. And then it's expanded by a guy named Jim Hogan, the next book over, Secret Agenda. And he says it was all the CIA. Everybody who went into the Watergate office building, except Gordon Liddy, had CIA connections. The CIA knew what was going on, and they let it happen because they didn't like Nixon. And then a little bit after that, and he says, you know, they never found a tap in a phone. The only taps were in McCord's briefcase. And McCord disappears for long periods of time. They can't figure out where McCord is. And then there's a book by Len Klodny called Silent Coup. And Silent Coup consists of two separate allegations. There was a military spy ring operating in the West Wing, which is true. And Al Haig was a part of it. And there's this guy named Admiral Wellender, and he was the liaison officer with the Pentagon, and he had this male secretary named Radford, Yeoman Radford, and Yeoman Radford ingratiated himself with the other NSC staff, and he would take their burn bags at the end of the day to go down to be shredded, and he'd make copies, and then they'd send it over to the Pentagon. And the assumption, the working assumption, is that he photocopied 5,000 documents. And what they say is, listen, Nixon and this crazy liberal professor from Harvard, Kissinger, they were talking to our mortal enemies, the Soviet Union and China, and they weren't telling us what they were doing, and they were announcing troop withdrawals in Vietnam. They hadn't cleared with us. We had to find out what was going on, so we undertook this perfectly legitimate campaign intelligence plan to learn what Nixon was up to. And then in the middle of the book, he gets some material from another author on John Dean. And he puts part 2 of his book. It's like he opened the book and inserted part 2, called Golden Boy. And this tells this bizarre tale. John Dean is dating this girl that he later marries, Maureen Biner. And Maureen is a party girl. And there's really not anything going on at the Democratic National Committee. It's a CIA honey trap next door at the Columbia Plaza Hotel. Maureen Biner's roommate, Heidi Rifkin, is the madame running it. And the DNC is merely availing themselves of these party girls for visiting firemen who come into Washington and want to have a good time. So you go to Maxine Wells' desk, you make a phone call, and you open the drawer, and there's pictures of girls. And you say, I kind of like 16. So 16 calls you back, and you arrange a date. Okay? This is all in the book. The worry was that Maureen Dean's picture was in the desk. The reason they were sent back in was to get it out of there. Now, Maureen's nickname amongst her friends was Clout, because she's dating the counsel to the president. And then each of those books has a subsequent book. I didn't list them all here, but as you go down the path, the one about Maureen Dean is called, the next iteration is called White House Call Girl. They found Heidi Rifkin's black book, and there's a book about that. And Haig's Coup, which is coming out this spring, is about the military spy ring going further. And you just don't know. I tell you these things because I have no knowledge. I'm not going to spend any time on them, but it's universally agreed that the break-in doesn't make sense. Nobody really investigated because the guys were caught red-handed. So they don't really have a good record. But these are fun books to read if you like those things.
There you go.
Okay, this is my website. If you go across the top, these are window shades across here. You go over to Legacy Forums, and what you get, I told you I did 39 different documentaries, and these are links. Here's foreign affairs, here's domestic affairs, and here's the structural initiatives. So if you have nothing better to do, there's 39 documentaries on there. You come back to research aids, and the two most significant things are down here at the bottom, an annotated Watergate chronology. It's 87 pages of day by day of what I think is significant. There's a little annotation, tells you why. If you need to go to sleep and you can't find yourself, read this or the tax code. Works out beautifully. And the other one, under research aids, is the Annotated Bibliography, where I've talked about the books by the victors, the books by the vanquished, and the books by the doubters. And so you can follow through depending on what you'd like to read. And then finally over here, skillfully hidden under the book, is new documents. And what I've listed there is stuff that's come to light since my book was published in 2015. And what we uncovered, we as me, James Vorenberg, a Harvard professor who was Cox's first hire and appointed himself to write that report. The most significant thing when they first started up was the report. He took staff notes in every staff meeting, and then he took them with him back to Harvard. And they surfaced after my book had gone to print. So I was reading through them, and I put dangerous documents and embarrassing documents in my book. If anything, these Vorenberg notes, and I think they're number 5 down this list, are nothing short of incredible. I mean, they knew, the whole staff knew that Jaworski was meeting with Cerrika. He'd come back and talk about their deals. And the development in Vorenberg's notes are hugely important. Historically, that's where you'd find them. We're going to go to Q&A. You should have thought of questions by this time. I'm trying to help, but we got to have questions.
When you were at the White House, how were you notified about the break-in?
The paper. The question was, how did I first learn about the break-in? And the answer was, it was in the paper. People in the White House, because the dominant newspaper is the Washington Post, everybody reads the Post in the morning. It sets the framework for discussion. You don't have to like their stories, but there it was. But it wasn't my problem. In the beginning, I didn't know Gordon had been involved. Remember, the lady said, the gentleman over here said, did the tenor change, while you were there? And I left two things out, if I may key off your question. I didn't realize that there was real trouble till my secretary told me that Gordon Liddy had been involved. And then I said the next thing I was involved with was the tapes. But that's not quite true. During April, when the thing is coming down but nobody knows, I was invited to lunch by the head of the criminal division, Henry Peterson, the renowned career DOJ guy. I was there 5 years and only one person ever invited me to go to lunch. I was not significant. I could go over to the White House mess, eat, come back to my desk, no big thing. And we go to lunch. We had a pleasant lunch. And then at the end of lunch, he says, I'm going to tell you something, and you got to keep it quiet. Haldeman and Ehrlichman are going down. They're going to have to resign, and they're going to be indicted. And I said, it's not possible, Henry. I work for John. I don't know Bob, but John's as straight as they come. He said, listen very carefully. They're going down, and I'm telling you, because I don't want you to do anything stupid. Don't jump in the water. Let it go, because you can't stop it. Okay? I didn't know. He goes back to the Department of Justice and he tells his colleagues in the criminal division and elsewhere, the only person you can talk to at the White House is Jeff Shepard. Nobody else. And then apparently he tells Nixon, it's supposed to be on the tapes, he talks to Nixon 19 times during the month of April to convince him he's got to fire his two best friends. And somewhere in there, because Henry tells me, I told the president I'd warned you. Well, thanks, Henry. The other thing that happened, and that should have alerted me. The other thing that happened, right after the Saturday Night Massacre, that's October 20th, 1973, we fire Archie Cox and Richardson and Ruckelshaus resign. I had the privilege of calling on Bob Bork, who's the acting Attorney General, Robert Bork, and asking Bob if we could please have some lawyers from the Department of Justice to defend the White House, because we don't happen to have any. Now, the Department of Justice has 1,000 lawyers. So, and that's who used to supply legal work for the White House staff. And Bob was not welcoming to see me. He said, you can hardly come over and ask our help when you just canned everybody. But he did allow us to post notices in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Old Town Alexandria and Washington, D.C., and at the Criminal Division of Main Justice, looking for volunteers to come help defend the White House. And we got 12. And that became St. Clair's staff. I hired St. Clair's staff. So I was involved earlier than I had remembered. I'm involved in helping out from the Saturday Night Massacre on. More questions. We still have, we got 15, sir.
Did it seem to you at the time that people were overreacting, or as you found out about the reaction within the White House, was your perception was that people were overreacting, or did it seem like they were trying to play catch up with events?
Well, the question is, did I think the White House staff was overreacting to the challenge, or did I think we were behind the 8 ball trying to play catch up?
Or something else.
Or something else. I was blissfully ignorant. It just wasn't on my watch. I had other things to do. I didn't sit around talking. I didn't seek out people until toward the end, when the 18-minute gap and the Saturday Night Massacre. I know from transcribing the tapes that the White House was really scrambling after April 30th. That's when Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, and Kleindings go, because they didn't know what John Dean had done. And they got these meetings with Nixon on tape where they're trying to figure out what he was doing. They were playing catch-up ball like mad. but I wasn't involved at that point. Sir?
John Mitchell resigns as Attorney General, I believe, in March 1972, which was
March 1st.
was it
Yes,
March 1st?
yes.
Thank
To pick a date.
you. Okay, which was a month or two before the Watergate break-in. What was the explanation for why he resigned as far as the public was concerned?
Well, the question is, why did Mitchell leave the Attorney General's office to go to CREEP? I think the real question is, why did he leave CREEP? But he was always going to run the committee to reelect the president. He postponed leaving the Attorney General's office because it was so much fun. It's far more rewarding personally to be Attorney General of the United States than to go scrounge in a campaign, where you're trying to convince the press and everything else, and all the other people do is bitch. So he probably should have come sooner. That may be one of the great weaknesses of Watergate, that the adult wasn't there early on enough to stop this. He comes on March 1st. March 30th is when Magruder says he got his permission to go forward. The break-in occurs June 17th, and Mitchell resigns on July 1st. So he's only head of CREEP for 5 months, something like that. That was the surprise when he resigned on July 1st. And we thought it was because of Martha. Boy, she was a handful. I mean, a real handful. If you can possibly avoid it, don't have an alcoholic wife. I mean, it really messes up. And picture, I took the slide down, but I had the big six, we'll start out next time. Mitchell has an alcoholic wife, and she's causing nothing but trouble. Haldeman and Ehrlichman are Christian Science. They don't drink. And the wives behave themselves. So the tension between the two groups is just immense. And each thought the other side was responsible for the Watergate break-in. It could be that John Dean deliberately, because he was the go-between, told the White House it's Mitchell's fault, told Mitchell it's the White House's fault. At trial, at the cover-up trial, Mitchell says, you can't introduce tapes in Nixon's office where they're talking about how guilty I am. That's so prejudicial, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. And Cerrika said, no harm, no foul. Who cares? You're guilty anyway, so don't worry about that. Mitchell was just beside himself because time and time again, the people at the White House talked about it being his responsibility, that this had happened on his watch. Ma'am.
Boggles my mind, and it's not so much the cover-up, is the reason that the event happened at all, that the break-in happened at all. Nixon won 49 states. There had to be some information that, yes, you've got to gather information, you're going to do your publicity, you're going to try to win this election, but why do the people that worked in CREEP have...
Great, I understand. The question is, isn't the fact of the break-in itself inexplicable? How come this occurred at all? And I have wonderful answers for you. At the time the plan was concocted, Nixon was terrified that Ted Kennedy would become the candidate by acclamation at the convention, that he'd skip all the primaries. And he'd already lost once to a Kennedy, and he was very bitter about it. They play rough. And so he wanted, it's not he approved the plan, but the fact there was going to be a campaign intelligence plan is just absolute. Then the question was, well, how did Gordon end up in charge? And I worry about that all the time because I was so opposed to him being on the staff in the first place. At one point in my brief life, I went to a drug conference in Delhi, New Delhi, in India. I hate to travel, but I did one international trip. I did two. I was out of the country when the break-in occurred. I was in Turkey looking in the opium crop. So I have a picture of me in the opium fields. I'm innocent. But this was a drug conference in Delhi. And Pat Moynihan was our ambassador to India. And Pat had been on Nixon's staff. And Pat's a neat guy. And lots of stories about Pat. And I went over and had dinner with him. And he walked me back to the hotel after dinner. And I was telling him that Bud Krogh, who was my immediate boss, they told him it's going to cost him $250,000 to mount a defense in the Plumbers case. And Pat had an interesting, I mean, nobody had any money. Pat had an interesting reaction. He said, you know, Jeff, this business we're in, this business of politics, attracts crazy people. We can't keep them out. You build these staffs based on volunteers, you know, and you need everybody you can find, and you really don't know who they are. He said the real test is what you do when you first think you might have hired a nut. But he said you can't stop them from getting there. It's what you do when you get an inkling that something's not right. And we failed that test. We failed that test miserably. Gordon shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been allowed to do that plan. Magruder wanted to fire him because he threatened his life. And they said, oh, no, don't let personal stuff get in the way. And Liddy, I mean, this crazy man, this militant, tough guy, who, you know, very few people can claim to have destroyed a presidency. Okay? Gordon can and John Dean can. And that's about it. That's about it. More questions. Ma'am.
Didn't Nixon have a list of what he considered enemies? You know,
Yeah, there was an enemies list. Yes. Yes.
Anti-war.
Yeah.
Well, that was during his first term.
Yeah, I may have started it. I may have, you've heard this here first. I just joined the staff. And they were doing these anti-war things, you know, the mobilization and the moratorium. There were 3 of them. They put the buses together to keep the kids from raiding. And I said, you know, we should keep a list of the people who are down there talking to these people, cheering them on, to be sure we don't include them when we have our parties and stuff like that. So we cut out articles of the newspaper reporting people who were doing stuff. And somebody told me Haldeman was really pleased with that idea that we should keep track of. Now, later it turns out, and this is the other part, you don't invite people to your home who've complained about your husband in public. You don't do that. John Dean goes in to see the president and says, we're going to trigger IRS audits on these people we don't like. You just wait till this is over. And I think he had a list of 12 that he had put together that he wanted to nail these people. And then he went over to Treasury and said, this is what we want. And of course, anytime you're on the White House staff, you learn the phrase, the president would like. You just make it up, but they don't know. And he goes over, and George Shultz is Secretary of the Treasury, and a guy named Johnny, I think it's Johnny Walker, who's head of the IRS. And they said, pound sand. We're just not going to do it. So it didn't occur, but boy, did it become public. And wasn't it crippling? Because people have the same response you have. You know, how dare you keep a list of people you don't like? But lots of people didn't like Nixon. He would have been on their list, you know, from day one. But still, I understand your reaction. It doesn't make it criminal. There could be a list today. There could be a list today of people who aren't coming down, you know, to have lunch with the White House people. Ma'am, no, you had one.
Yeah.
We need another there, sir.
If Mark Felt was deep throat or one of the deep throats,
Yeah.
the FBI was investigating, and Justice or Attorney or U.S. Attorney was investigating, why did he surreptitiously talk to the journalists?
Max Holland's theory is that Felt was leaking to Woodward and Bernstein because he was trying to show that Pat Gray was not able to control the FBI. He wasn't doing it to bring Nixon down. But understand what's happening. Earl Silbert and his team are running the grand jury. They're discovering stuff all the time. They either orally or in writing prepare reports. I'm making this up, but weekly, here's where things stand. And they'd send the report to Peterson, Henry Peterson, who's head of the criminal division, and a copy would go to the head of the FBI. Well, when Pat Gray fell into disrepute, they stopped sending Pat Gray stuff. They started sending it to Mark Felt. So Mark is getting periodic updates on where the investigation is. That's what he's leaking to Woodward and Bernstein. That's why their articles are so authoritative, but don't help the prosecutors, because that's what they already know that. But the public doesn't.
Well, that's the theory of the book, but do we know whether that's the case? Or?
I like the theory. I don't know. Well, you asked if I can prove it's true. No, I can't prove it's true. Remember, Mark Felt is senile when he's outed. So it's just one of those. It's one of those things. We can't prove it or disprove it. We've hit the magic hour. We will see you in a week. Thank you for coming.